Yeah, in response to some feedback, there are going to be a few changes around here as I attempt to improve my videos and try to fool people into thinking I know what I'm doing. Anyway, on to the video. Lots of excitable journos and poll profs on Twitter are going to be getting into a froth about the coming local elections. Is this just because those with an interest in the political are all big old nerds and get excited by anything electoral? Yes, it kind of is, yeah. Excuse the rat noises. Or do we on the left need to be looking at this as an opportunity to exert some political influence? Also yes. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's make sure we all know what we're talking about when we say local elections. So let's make sure we define what we are talking about here. Typically, a local election in the UK refers to the democratic election of councillors, which are essentially local politicians who manage services and resources at a regional, city or parish level. There is a bit of variance in the frequency of such elections, with some councils running a full council election every 4 years, where all councillors will stand for re-election at the same time, whereas others will elect a third of the council every year, with the fourth year being free of elections. It's important to understand that there are tiers to local government that determine the amount of power, responsibility and resources available to that particular council. Here is how the responsibilities differ between tiers, as described at gov.uk. Starting with county councils: education, transport, fire and public safety, social care, libraries, trading standards, waste management. The next tier down is the district, borough and city councils. These cover a smaller area and are usually responsible for services such as rubbish collection, recycling, council tax collections, housing, planning applications. Finally, we have the lowest tier, which is the parish, community and town councils. These deal with smaller issues such as allotments, public clocks, bus shelters, community centres, play areas and play equipment, grants to help local organisations, and consultations on neighbourhood planning. So now that we have a feel for what we are talking about, let's think some more about the issues that are important to consider when talking of local government by looking at the context. All of the services we have just spoken about are funded via a mix of central government funding and local revenue from council taxes and business rates. Though we should point out that since 2010, local councils have lost a lot of funding from the government. This graph from instituteforgovernment.org ably demonstrates how council taxes have increased, but overall funding is reducing, putting pressure on local authorities, especially given the increasing cost of social care as the population ages. Whilst councils are unable to change non-council tax rates, universal credit payments or large-scale infrastructure spending, with a few exceptions, there is an awful lot that impacts daily life, and often more directly than a lot of government policy will. In fact, councils are largely responsible for the physical implementation of a lot of government policy, albeit with a small amount of wiggle room for interpretation, so we do need to take seriously their ability to do both good and huge amounts of harm. Councils like Preston's, for example, have shown the way forward with a locally focused and holistic approach to local government, paying a living wage, investing in sympathetic local businesses, and essentially planning for prosperity in the long term by investing in the local economy. However, the loss of such a large amount of funding from the government has meant that some councils have turned to commercial property speculation as a way to make up the shortfall. As touched on in Podcasting as Praxis's recent episode 198, this often doesn't pay off, as was shown when Thurrock Council became effectively bankrupt after using loans to invest in solar farms which failed to materialise the return they needed to balance the books. Do check out that episode. It is shocking. The subsequent financial crisis in Thurrock has led to the council being given an exemption from the usual council tax rise limit of 5%, and instead will inflict a 10% rise on its residents, whilst also selling off local facilities to balance the books. So, we can easily summarise that councils can have a big impact on the lives of local people, and the services they engage with every day, whether it be buses, bins or parks, and whether for good or bad. These things are important and definitely need to be taken seriously by the left, and not be completely ceded to the Liberals and Tories out of some mistaken focus on the big picture. Good local councillors are both vital to the wider movement and in being able to make positive changes to people's lives right now. That being said, it is also important to understand that political parties can overstate the importance of local elections with regards to the national picture, ascribing to it an importance that translates to something like a general election practice run. It is often missed in news coverage of these sort of electoral events that local councils can have a huge influence on their own electoral destiny, upsetting national trends and engaging directly with their local community in a way that MPs can't. People get excited about how much local elections can impact the wider political landscape. And it can impact leaderships, political capital, etc., but only because of the amount of capital that is assigned to it. It's kind of like placing your life savings on a horse at the bookies, and then telling everyone how important that horse is to your future. It is, but only because you have made it so. Take the BBC's recent effort. Local elections are the biggest test of political opinion in England ahead of the next general election. More than 8,000 seats are up for grabs this time. The elections are about everything from potholes to council tax and how much we should all pay for local services, but the results will also give us a good idea of the lay of the political land. Are the Conservatives struggling? Is Labour gaining enough support to win the next general election? Are the Liberal Democrats about to eat into Tory heartlands in the south of England? Ultimately, we can talk about national scandals and the latest polling, but people have a track record of voting differently in local elections. Sometimes because they get to know local candidates more closely and may vote beyond their traditional boundaries based on local knowledge and personal experience. A good example of this would be the Aspire group in Tower Hamlets, which was led by former Labour council leader Lutfur Rahman, who had been temporarily banned from electoral involvement after accusations of voting fraud and malpractice, and was thus removed from Labour. Despite all this, Aspire took control of the council in 2022, winning 24 of the 45 seats, with Lutfur Rahman being elected mayor. Sometimes voters will vote less predictably because the level of power up for grabs in local elections is fairly modest, and a good way of indicating discontent with a major party. The Lib Dems and Greens traditionally do very well in local elections for this reason, and because they focus on local issues quite separate from their national parties, they're seen as a less radical option than they would perhaps be considered in Parliament. Likewise, protest parties like UKIP and Reform tend to fare quite well in locals too, as people signal to their usual parties that their discontent with current personnel policy and performance may see them taking their votes elsewhere in the general election too. Turnouts tend to be a lot smaller, meaning you can also get some quite dramatic results. The difference of 100 votes in a local election is often enough to change a result, so a small increase or decrease in turnout can potentially swing a seat very quickly. Also, the demographic for voting in local elections tend to skew towards the older, towards homeowners, and towards political types. So it is a much less representative cross-section of society typically. So we on the left should probably just ignore all this kerfuffle then. Well, no, actually. With the left electorally adrift at the moment, why should we care about local elections? A lot of us, I know, came from Labour, where, if we're being honest, the reputation of Labour councillors was largely that they were terrible people with terrible politics. But if you look at the three reasons I suggested for why local elections are not a good predictor for a general election, that local influence is more important than national PR, that people are more open to lending their vote at a local election, and that a small change can have a big impact on the final result, to understand the political power of the left is to understand the same thing that the UK right already understands, which is the importance of political capital. That's right, you thought you were safe from definitions here in this section, but you were wrong. To Wikipedia. Political capital can be understood as a type of currency used to mobilise voters, achieve policy reform, or accomplish other political goals. There is more to politics than legislature and seats in Parliament. And once we grasp that, the current political situation seems ever so slightly less impregnable than before. When we consider the single biggest political upheaval of recent times, the Brexit referendum and the following general elections that were held in its wake, we can question where the demand came from for such a referendum. It had long been mooted as a topic by fringe Tories and a small percentage of the population, but it was weaponised and turned into political capital by UKIP, who were able to peel away enough support from the main two parties that it scared both into a political reaction. The Tories, under Thomas the Tank Engine-faced and alleged pig botherer David Cameron, had to promise to hold a referendum on Brexit to protect their vote share and tempt back enough UKIP supporters to defeat a Labour that many had tipped to win the election in 2015. It may well have been that this was the difference in the 2015 general election, much as it was arguably in the following two elections as well. UKIP were able to demonstrate enough political capital to influence national politics via polls, media appearances, and yes, local and Euro elections. Take the following from The Guardian in 2012. Although it has so far failed to convert that share of the vote into significant gain in seats, UKIP appears to have done more than enough to ruffle Tory feathers and put pressure on an already creaking coalition. Gary Streeter, Conservative MP for Devon South West, lost no time in seizing on the defections as evidence of why David Cameron needs to reassert his party's traditional values. We need to work out a strategy, certainly in the West Country, for dealing with the issue of traditional voters shuffling off and voting UKIP because they don't think our leadership is conservative enough, he told the BBC. Indeed, in 2014, Michael Gove said the quiet part out loud. There has been a vote for UKIP. And that sends us a very clear message that people have concerns about immigration, about welfare, about schools, and skills, of course, said Michael Gove, the Conservative Education Minister. We will pay attention to those concerns. Now, obviously, that is a lazy Tory spin on the phenomena, but all the same, it demonstrates that if you can prove a sizable chunk of politically active voters are looking for a certain type of policy, it becomes a draw for the bigger parties, and can shape future manifestos in our two-party system. Add to that the good that local councillors can do, and you can see how there are opportunities to be had in local elections, and that these opportunities present a much smaller challenge than on a national stage of a general election. Now, I'm saying all of this far too late in the day for anybody to enter the field at this year's local elections. The candidates are already nominated, the postal votes are in, and polling day fast approaches. But there are two things you can still consider as a voter of the left. Firstly, think about how you can declare your political alignment via your vote. If there is a left option, a Northern Independence Party, Breakthrough Party, or a Tusk candidate, consider giving them your vote. You may directly elect a councillor, of course. The margins are small in these elections, but even if not, you are signalling that an electorally active voter exists who votes for left-wing policies. If enough people do this, it starts to become a noticeable chunk of the electorate, and this begins the process of influencing the mainstream parties. If no left-wing candidate is available, which is the case for me where I am, then you could choose to support the lesser evil, though as per my video linked here, that may be a miscalculation in the longer term. Rather than compromising your voting power by surrendering it to a mainstream party and endorsing their current platform, you could instead spoil your ballot. Spoiled ballots can also signal a sizable chunk of electorally active voters that are not interested in the current offering, and for those parties intellectually curious enough to interrogate the data afterwards, this may start to influence their future plans. Regardless, whatever you may feel about the politics on display, it is simply important you signal both your electoral activity and your political intent to the largest extent possible. The only way to create space for left-wing political capital is to take it from those that assume it to be part of their own voter base. And let's be candid here, we are talking about Labour, and to a much lesser extent the Greens. We need to create a left voter bloc shaped hole in the support for Labour and demonstrate that it is both active and willing to withhold its votes until we start to see both some representation and some policy that reflects our voter coalition. I don't want to retread too much of my lesser evil video here, but ultimately any support for Labour under the pretense of get the Tories out or anyone is better than the Tories is a false economy and simply delays left political influence for another election cycle. Once they have your vote, they don't care what you wanted in exchange for it. The wallet inspector will not be coming back. Labour is unlikely to ever again be a party of the left, and I'm not suggesting all of this as a route to recapture the party. Rather that it may still be possible to influence it in ways that can help the people of our country in the shorter term, or even to hurry the self-destruction of the party so that something altogether healthier can replace it, like my pet rats, which you can hear loudly drinking. A poor performance in the local elections for Labour will increase pressure on Starmer and the Labour right to re-examine their current strategy towards courting the worst people you know. Given their current level of strategising and their ability to continually pick the wrong option, they might well lurch further to the right, but that will simply signal to the Labour left that maybe it's time to leave the sinking ship and instead strengthen an electoral left beyond the mainstream binary. Or, maybe, they will start adding some left-wing policy to their platform that may help people in the short term, whilst we build an electoral alternative to the ailing political roadkill that is the Labour Party. Either way, it has to be better than putting your money on a horse that is determined to kick your head in. So to sum up, make sure you vote, or spoil your vote in a way that signals your political alignment to the parties involved. But do go to the polls. Apathy is disregarded much quicker than any vote or spoiled ballot. Opportunities exist for the left to gain ground in local elections and create a base for future electoral strategy. Councillors can have a big impact on people's lives, and having good councillors is still a worthy goal and not something that we should allow to slip beneath our notice. Thank you for joining me on this whistle-stop tour of local elections and listening to my thoughts on why the left shouldn't disregard local politics, especially at a time when so much is at stake. We need comrades involved everywhere we can to mitigate the absolute mess that is national politics in this very silly country of ours. Give the video a like if you've enjoyed it, subscribe for more content, and speak to your local lefties about what you can do to make a difference. It's time for the left to be seen and heard in our communities. Bye for now.